If anyone ever made a novel about the story of the Beatles, I feel like Phil Spector would be like that one villain that everyone hates even though he's not even the main antagonist. He only worked with the band for a couple of months and he was given an album that was pretty much ready. The only thing he had to do was put it all together, and somehow he still did a terrible job. A lot of you here probably know about Phil Spector's production techniques, choirs, string arrangements, echo, overdubs, the typical thing you wouldn't find in a Beatles album, but somehow for some reason George Harrison and John Lennon wanted him to work on the album. Something I think a lot of you don't really understand is that even though Let It Be was shelved and, they moved on to Abbey Road, the album was pretty much finished, okay? George Martin did most of the production work on the album. Phil Spector was only responsible for mastering the final version of the songs, and that's why you find so many choirs and echoes in songs like Across the Universe, I Me Mine, and The Long and Winding Road. And even though I feel like he did a really good job with most of the album, I also feel like there's moments where he contradicts the idea of the live album Let It Be supposed to be. For example, Paul McCartney wrote a whole letter to him and Alan Klein about all the add-ons, the choirs and the horns he added to The Long and Winding Road. He demanded all these elements to be taken off of the song before it was released because he didn't consent to it. Phil basically changed the aura and the intent behind a song without consulting the artist first. But even after the fiasco of Let It Be, because even though fans and critics love the album and I love it too, when you compare it to the work of George Martin in albums like Abbey Road, Sgt. Pepper, Revolver, Rubber Soul, it's clear that the album would have been much better had it been produced by George Martin alone. Even then, George Harrison and John Lennon went on to defend the work of Phil Spector in this album and had him as a producer on their own solo albums as well. Plastic Ono Band, Imagine, Sometime in New York City, I believe, and All Things Must Pass. And let me tell you, it didn't have the best results. Yeah, the albums are amazing. All Things Must Pass, in my opinion, is one of the greatest albums ever made. However, George Harrison went on to say that working with Phil Spector was very difficult. He was drunk most of the time. He didn't really show up to most of the recordings. He didn't listen to George and his vision for the album, and he ended up regretting working with him, especially because he felt like the album had too much echo all over the place. The overdubbing, the constant weird methodical ways to record the songs was kind of annoying too. Basically, Phil wasn't acting as a producer. He was acting like the mastermind behind the album the few times that he actually showed up to the studio. I know a lot of people like to defend Phil and his work with the Ronettes and how he inspired Brian Wilson to make Pet Sounds, with the wall of sound technique, but I think it's safe to say that his work with the Beatles was really poor, and even if he didn't have all the cards available while making Let It Be, when you go to Imagine, Plastic Ono Band, and All Things Must Pass, production is not exactly the best part out of any of those albums. So yeah, he was definitely a great producer, very influential, but his work with the Beatles, terrible.